Okay, it looks like we are recording and we are live streaming now, it appears, on YouTube. Okay, it looks like, is Dennis still here? Did we lose Dennis? Okay, I don't see Dennis, but maybe he'll come back. Okay, can you guys hear me and everything? Okay, we're good. Okay, so I want to welcome everybody to our panel today. So this is the first session of 3 that we're having. It's a panel that's supported by the Society for Systematic Philosophy. My name is Greg Moss. I'm the vice president of the society. And today we're having a panel on classical German philosophy and philosophy of religion. And we'll have 2 presenters. Nahum Brown will be moderating, and he will introduce them in just a minute. I just want to say something briefly about the Society for Systematic Philosophy. It was founded, as Richard tells me, in 1977. The first president was Ken Lee Dove. And the society used to meet in New York City around the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research. And they eventually moved to meet at the APA. And recently we've decided to not meet there anymore. And we will probably be meeting in different places very regularly online, perhaps probably in the future in Germany in conjunction with Christoph Asmuth's society and his Forschungsnetzwerk. So in the future, you can look out for different events that we'll be doing both virtually and online. So the Society for Systematic Philosophy is a pretty small group. We're generally interested in promoting and practicing the autonomy of philosophy in the spirit of Richard Winfield's philosophy without foundations. And traditionally we're inspired by Hegel's philosophy, although we're interested in Western and non-Western philosophy insofar as it helps us enrich our discourse and our investigation into these issues. We do a lot of panels and a lot of work on classical German philosophy, German idealism, and that kind of thing. I just want to share really briefly the website. So if anyone's interested, they can go and look at it. So it's the societyforsystematicphilosophy.org. And I'll just share this real quick. So this is us right here. And you can look at the officers, the members. If you're interested in becoming a member or just, it's free. If you want to know more about us, you can email Emre. Emre, can you raise your hand so people can see you? You know who you are? There he is. That's Emre. We have a page for upcoming events. This hopefully will be updated regularly. And then a catalog of past events, an events archive. You can see the kind of thing that we've been doing. We also have a vlog where we'll be posting videos such as this one. So if you want to watch this after the fact, you can do it on YouTube or you can do it here. We already have one video up here already. This was a discussion that we had with Richard Winfield and many of his students when he was running for Senate. Okay, so that's that. I'll stop the share. So that's just a quick word about the society, and I'll hand it over now to Nahum.
Great, hi. Greg, thanks for organizing this, and thanks everyone for participating and coming. It's nice to do this together, and it's I wish that we could be in person, of course, but this is also really pleasant, and it's good to be connected like this. So, is Dennis not here? He's disappeared from the. There's something maybe wrong with his internet. I'll just introduce myself, and then Cecelia, if Dennis doesn't come back in time, do you mind being the first person?
So I have my daughter, who is 3.5, is about to go to nursery. So she'll probably come storming in to say goodbye before she leaves. If you...
I don't mind that.
So I was planning, to just stop the video for 1 minute while Dennis was talking. So in principle, I don't mind going first, but that there will be an interruption. So I don't know, Greg.
Let me follow up real quick. I'll send Dennis an email and oh, he's back now. He's back.
Okay,
no worries. All right. Thanks. Sorry about that confusion. Let's see. He's coming back.
No problem. As I said, I'll be here. It's just yeah.
Totally understand.
Sorry about that. Internet just died on me, but I'm back. I'm sorry.
Wait. Nahum, sorry.
Back. Making contingency plans with that. This is better. Okay, so good. I'm Nahum Brown. I teach philosophy in Japan and Miyazaki at Miyazaki International College in Japan, and I did my dissertation on Hegel. I defended in 2014 at the University of Guelph under J. Lampert. I've been working on the science of logic for a number of years. So these topics look great. Let's jump into it. I think let's save maybe 15 minutes for a conversation after the talk. So Dennis, if you want to speak for about, let's see, it's 4:10 Hong Kong time now, for about 35 minutes or so. Let me introduce you. Dennis Vanden Auweele. Do I say your name right? Auweele? I have trouble pronouncing.
That's fine.
It's okay, sorry. Is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Leuven. He received his PhD in philosophy in 2014 with a thesis entitled Pessimism in Kant and Schopenhauer. Since then, he has been working on the post-Kantian philosophy of religion and philosophy of culture, with a special interest in Schopenhauer, Schelling, and Nietzsche. His books include Exceeding Reason, Freedom and Religion in Schelling and Nietzsche. De Gruyter, it was published in 2020 with De Gruyter. And the second book, Pessimism in Kant's Ethics and Rational Religion, was published in 2019 with Lexington Books. And a third book, The Kantian Foundation of Schopenhauer's Pessimism, with Routledge in 2017. So the title of the talk I have here is Schopenhauer and the Later Schelling in Dialogue on Mythology and Religion. Without further ado, Dennis, do you want to begin?
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Nam, for that introduction. Thanks, Greg, for introducing me. Thank you all for being here and for turning your cameras on. Most of the time when I'm teaching, I only see black screens in front of me, and it's very disheartening sometimes, so I'm happy to see some faces. I have a PowerPoint here, so I'm going to share that with you, so you have something other to look at than my ugly face. So I think you can see the PowerPoint now, right? Can I get a thumbs up if you can see it? All right, great. So as Nam announced, my talk today will be on Schopenhauer and Schelling, the later Schelling specifically, in their views on religion and mythology. And I'm going to venture into a bold undertaking, namely to put those two philosophers into a sort of dialogue. Why do I do this? So something that's always fascinated me philosophically is the way we think about the sort of binary opposition almost between the Enlightenment and Romanticism. So if you would go to a sort of introductory course in philosophy, you would learn that the Enlightenment was all about rationalism and autonomy, self-determination, critical reason, and Romanticism was a sort of momentary relapse into the spheres of mysticism, art, religion, ecstasy, all those sort of things that proper philosophers leave well behind. I always found that to be a sort of a simplistic view, not only of Romanticism, obviously, but of also their relationship between Romanticism and the Enlightenment. And I felt that that sort of binary opposition did not do justice to the richness of their relationship. And it was then none other than the great Hegel who actually taught me that the Enlightenment and Romanticism were not quite as opposed as most present them to be. Hegel, reading through Hegel, and I'm sure many of you are readers of Hegel. Hegel taught me that that there's a dialectical relationship between the sort of rationality, the outwardness, the critique, the emphasis on Vernunft, on Verstand, on understanding in the Enlightenment, and that is in a dialectical relationship with the sort of inwardness that you find in Romanticism. Inwardness, a turn to the self, the subject, looking inside, towards feeling, towards religion, towards art, towards communities. That all happens from something somewhere within. And Hegel showed me that if you look at that inner feeling that is sort of put forward by Romanticism, you can see that as not the absolute other of reason, but equally an expression of Geist. And that even enlightened rationality is somewhat limited. And it has to be enriched in its dialectical relationship with the inwardness of Romanticism by showing that all of these are expressions of spirit. So reason, philosophy, art are equally expressions of Geist, spirit. And there is no such thing as an absolute other to reason, because reason is able to dialectically sublate, aufheben, the difference between these different spheres of being. So I found that to be a refreshing point of view. But what I found to be lacking in that point of view, and that's why I turned to Schopenhauer and Schelling, is that I feel that with Hegel, there is no room for a sort of communication that comes from art and religion, and I'll focus just on religion today. A communication that somehow precedes or transcends reason per se. It's a critique given by the late Schelling that for religion or revelation to be interesting at all, it has to contain something in excess of reason, not just in excess of Verstand, but in excess of Vernunft as well, in excess of reason. I found that to be an attractive position, but Hegel does not seem to allow for room for something expressing in religion that is beyond the confines of a larger philosophy of absolute spirit. And that's why I was very interested in reading the philosophies of religion of Schopenhauer and Schelling as ways of accommodating a different view on religion than what I feel is a bit of an almost totalitarian view that you find in Hegel. Hegel is more nuanced than, say, Kant, for instance. Kant is fairly totalitarian with his Verstandsreligion. But I find the same thing going on with Hegel as well. So I'm looking for resources to sort of combat that view of religion that has become so dominant since Hegel. And that's why I turn to these two illustrious figures, Schelling and Schopenhauer, and I'm aiming to put them in a sort of dialogue where their views and their differences in their views on religion and mythology can actually mutually enrich. Now, some of you might interject already now and say, well, to have a dialogue, you need to have two things. You need to have a sort of disagreement, obviously, but you also need to have a sort of common vantage point, a starting point, a basis from which to start. And these two guys, Schelling and Schopenhauer, besides that Schopenhauer was indicted with plagiarizing Schelling and Schopenhauer indicted Schelling with plagiarizing Kant, besides that, there does seem to be not a lot of vantage point from which to start this investigation. Schelling is one of the famous German idealists. Schopenhauer had a special place in hell reserved for all German idealists. Schelling, in his later philosophy, is seen as sort of a reactionary Christian, especially by those who attended his later Berlin lectures. And Schopenhauer was called by none other than Nietzsche an intuitive atheist, someone for whom atheism was so self-evident that he did not even find the need to argue for it. And Schelling is a famous enthusiast for systematic reason, and Schopenhauer is well known for elevating a more intuitive sense of knowing over more systematic reason. And in that, Schopenhauer somewhat prepares for Nietzsche's famous comment that he mistrusts all systematizers. The will to system is a lack of integrity. Schopenhauer himself once said that you should mistrust all saccharine metaphysics. Any page where you cannot read blood, murder, and other nasty things is not worth reading. So there does not seem to be a lot of a vantage point. So my talk will be in large part focused on trying to give you that vantage point from which you can actually make a constructive comparison and a constructive dialogue between Schelling and Schopenhauer. And I will do that in their views on religion and mythology. Now, so the point I'm trying to make, just to bring the whole thing home, is that I want to read Schopenhauer and Schelling as figures who try to assign a more robust function to mythology and religion than Hegel, and I want to engage them in a dialogue on this subject. So that's sort of the point of this paper. So the first question you need to address at this point is whether there is truth in religion at all. It's a question that needs addressing because there were a good number of Enlightenment figures who would deny would deny such a thing, that there would be truth in religion. I find Schelling and Schopenhauer, that's their first vantage point, to be saying, yes, there is truth in religion. So for Schopenhauer, truth is in religion, but it cannot possibly be there in a sort of literal sense. A literal sense would be that religion literally means what it says. If that's the case, then religion is without all truth. So if there's truth not in a literal sense, there must be truth in a different sense. That sense must be allegorical, according to Schopenhauer. So what Schopenhauer means by allegory is that religion expresses something by means of symbol, parable, story, myth, ritual, that means something else. So religion tries to enliven a sort of attitude within us. It can be truthful if it enlivens a proper attitude in us. So the main distinction that Schopenhauer makes between religions is not based on their outward clothing, whether they're monotheistic, polytheistic, atheistic, whatever. The basic difference between religions is whether they're pessimistic or optimistic. And for those of you who know Schopenhauer, you would know that he is more in favor of pessimistic religions than optimistic religions. He never calls himself a pessimist, not that I found. He's keen on lampooning optimism, though. But in the sphere of religion, he's quite emphatic that the only truthful religions are those who are pessimistic. Now, how does that happen for Schopenhauer? For Schopenhauer, religion communicates, if it's truthful, obviously, a fundamentally pessimistic message through stories, symbols, parables. And there are some hallmarks of a proper or good religion for Schopenhauer. He doesn't spell these out, so you have to sift through his somewhat scattered comments on various religions to sort of figure out what his criteria are. He doesn't have any sort of a systematic philosophy of religion at all, really. It's really something you have to puzzle together yourself. But what I found to be criteria for good religion are 5 criteria. The first 2 are pass or fail, and the 3rd, 4th, and 5th are more gradual. So you could be at once a pessimistic or an optimistic religion, but you can also be a more pessimistic religion than other pessimistic religions. So there's those 2 axes taken into account. I'll briefly mention these different criteria for good religion. The first is to see existence itself as a sort of punishment. Punishment, so life is not something that is a good, it's not a gift, it's not something you should cherish, it is to be seen as a punishment. In his slightly limited understanding of religions, he deems that Christianity sees existence as a punishment, original sin. It is the only thing that reconciles him to Judaism, that's the doctrine of original sin. So Judaism is still okay right here. And Hinduism and Buddhism are for him equally pessimistic religions because they see life as we know it, life as being attached to worldly things, samsara, as a punishment that in your previous life you did not reach the stage of nirvana. So you have some intellectual deficiencies in your previous life for which you pay right now. In Christianity, it's more of a moral deficiency. Both see existence as a punishment. Islam, paganism of any form, Pelagianism, view life as too much of a gift, as something that is good in itself, and therefore are already excluded from the denominator pessimistic religion. Second criteria is to look upon works in the broadest sense imaginable, as something that is useless. Moral works intellectual works, works of whatever kind, are no road to redemption. If you look on works, things you can do in this world to engage with this world, that is something that is more of a distraction than a redemption. In this, Schopenhauer is quite harsh on Catholicism, calling Catholicism a baseless, trite, optimistic sense of Pelagianism, because the Catholic Church, in his view, emphasizes only good works. I think that's a bit of a limited view of Catholicism, but is limited in many ways, Schopenhauer. Protestantism fares well, because Protestantism emphasizes the first and foremost need for grace, and rejects the notion that works would justify. And again, Hinduism and Buddhism fare well, because they teach us not to engage with this world, but to retract from this world. The third, fourth, and fifth criteria are gradual, so you can be more or less pessimistic. In the extent to which you see actions of compassion as a gateway to aesthetics is another hallmark feature of a pessimistic religion. Here, Schopenhauer is quite harsh on Protestantism, because he views two senses of Protestantism. You have a sense of monasticism, where you do not engage in compassionate actions, only in ascetics. And you have a sense of Protestantism, which is gets stuck on the level of compassion and doesn't move to ascetics. For instance, he's very harsh on traditions within Protestantism that do not advocate celibacy, especially for priests. Celibacy is a hallmark feature of ascetics, obviously. So your compassionate actions in this world, they should be geared towards making you an ascetic. They should not be something you do for their sake alone, but you should do them for the sake of self-denial. Fourth and fifth, I'll take together. Fourth and fifth is to see your religion as somewhat surrounded in mystery. And when it's surrounded in mystery, you already get some sort of a hint that the doctrines that emerge in that religion are not per se doctrines that are valuable in themselves, but already communicate something non-literal. So Schopenhauer believes that much of Christianity is very much at risk of being taken literally. It's a historical narrative, Christianity, an eschatological narrative. There's appeal to miracles, to specific moments in time. So it is at risk of being taken too literally. While in his understanding, Buddhism and Hinduism, especially the Upanishads and Vedas, so that the sort of highest text in Hinduism, they are not as much at risk of being taken literally. So that's why the ranking for Schopenhauer goes Buddhism, Hinduism, an authentic sense of Christianity, so not Catholicism or Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism, Islam, paganism. So that's the sort of, he ranks things, he likes to rank things, I think. So that's his sort of view of the hierarchy between religions. So to bring it all home, when does religion express truth? When it, through an allegorical message, communicates that life is terrible, that works do not justify, that you need to self-deny, and you have to clothe that message in a sense of mystery so that that message will not be at risk of being taken literally. That's, in a nutshell, a very simplified version of Schopenhauer's philosophy of religion. And I will circle back to Schopenhauer at the end of this talk to show that what I just told you now is just one side of the coin. But you need to know this first, and now I will move to Schelling, and it will be quite obvious why I moved to Schelling. Just a terminological clarification. Schopenhauer does not make a distinction between religion and mythology, so I can use both at the same time. For Schelling, there is a very important distinction between mythology and religion. So I will only speak in Schelling about mythology and not about religion, revealed religion. That's a whole different domain. So if I ask the question again, is there truth in mythology according to Schelling? Well, if there would be a lack of truth in mythology, this would be what Schelling calls a purely poetic view of mythology. Poetic view of mythology would be a view where mythology does not aim to assert something, to teach something, to arouse certain dispositions, but it only exists to satisfy a sort of poetic drive for invention. It's something plucked from the air just because it's nice to do. That would be a sort of poetic view of mythology, where the poets, the great poets like Homer and Hesiod, are the true originators of mythology. Now, Schelling signals that there are three problems with a view where there's a total lack of any and all truth in mythology. The first problem is that it's quite clear that the poets do not invent mythology. So Homer and Hesiod did not sit down one day and came up with the Greek mythological world they didn't pluck it from their heads. It's quite clear that a people, the Greek people, the Roman people, that they are the true inventors of a mythology. There's no singular individual who can say, well, he or she did it. No, it's a sort of a people's work. So you can't quite pinpoint who is the poetic inventor. But the major issue that Schelling actually points out is that there are so many strong similarities between mythologies worldwide that it would be almost miraculous that they would be merely invented by poets. What Schelling is here engaging in is something, he doesn't give enough credit to it, to the whole discussion, but there was a contemporary of his, Kreutzer was his name, from Marburg, was a philologist, was actually at sort of the eye of the storm of very heated debate in philology at the time, because what happened in the early 19th century is that because of many political reasons and so on, a lot of philosophy, theology, literature from the East and Far East made its way to Europe, especially Indian mythology, Chinese mythology as well. Middle Eastern mythology was becoming more and more available. And this somewhat bombarded the Western European people with an abundance of knowledge about that. And they could not help but to notice that especially Indian mythologies was so very similar to the mythologies that they knew. Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Egyptian mythology. No, they had settled on something that, Greek, Roman, Egyptian mythology, they are similar, and the reason is quite simple, for the Romantics at least. They all go back to what they call a Pelasgian mythology. Pelasgian would be the sort of primal European mythology of all the peoples around the Mediterranean Sea, and from that developed Egyptian mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Norse mythology, and so on. But now they found out that their mythologies are so remarkably similar to the ancient texts surrounding early Judaism, to Indian mythology, Brahmanism, the Vedas, Upanishads, even Chinese mythology, that there could not be a sort of mutual influencing on that. So Kreutzer somewhat launched the very inflammable thesis that mythology really started in India, somewhere the 7th century before Christ. The Brahmins were given a sort of primal revelation, which they put into stories. Those stories traveled from India to the Middle East, starting Judaism and other religions at that time, to Egypt and across the Mediterranean. So basically, Kreutzer said that Greek mythology and Germanic mythology, remember, this is a time of romanticism and nationalism and folklore and full-blown history in your own mythology. Kreutzer said all of this is just watered down Indian mythology. So that was a very inflammable thesis at the time, given that nationalism. So Schelling was, through Kreutzer, very well aware that there were so many strong similarities between these mythologies that to say that it's just a poetic invention is just absurd and nonsense to him. There's a slight problem with Schelling's assessment of the poetic view here, but I won't go into detail on that because I'm keeping an eye on the time. But it does seem to be inconsistent with his earlier views of art in his philosophy of art, but I won't go into that at the moment. So his sort of final statement on the poetic view is that Homer and Hesiod added poetry to the mythic consciousness, but what he calls the dark foundry of mythology, the myth itself, must be beyond all poetry. And the two oldest poets are not the originators of mythology, but they signal an exit from mythology. They show that we have taken a step back or a step forward, really, from the original birthing place, from that dark foundry. They're an exit, not the beginning. So you could say you have myth, and the poets logi, making it mythology. There's already a stepping away from myth the moment you start writing it down, even the moment you start talking about it. There's the moment you start systematizing it, thinking about it. So you take a step away from the total immersion, the unfree immersion, what Schelling calls, into mythic consciousness. So a total lack of truth in religion is just equally to Schelling preposterous. What sort of truth would there then be in mythology? And this is where Schelling attends to the allegorical interpretation of mythology. So here is the spot you think you find the best place to put a dialogue, to engage a dialogue between Schelling and Schopenhauer. Now, Schelling is quite harsh on the allegorical interpretation of mythology. He takes it that allegory means that what what mythology says, which is a doctrine and history of the gods, basically, is not what it means. It means something quite differently. There is a reasonable philosophical truth being expressed through mythology, but it is not the doctrine and history of the gods. It signals something else, something else. Now, that's something else. It signals something else. But what does it signal then? Well, Schelling reads the allegorical interpretation that it signals something reasonable, something that is logos. It can be morality, it can be history, it can be science, it can be philosophy. You know, all these sort of allegorical interpretations of mythology. Homeros is one of those famous ones. And Schelling sort of does away with all of these, somewhat callously, to be honest, with a very, very simple argument, but I think a very interesting one. Namely, we've shown actually with our engagement with the poetic view that myth must precede logos, that logos, in whatever way, poetic logos or scientific, philosophical logos, so myth precedes those. So how can logos be at the start of mythology? This is basically Schelling's question to Hegel all over again. So you know Schelling's famous question to Hegel. Well, Hegel, you've shown how the world is caught into the net of reason, but how did it get there? So how does that net of reason get started? So if myth precedes logos, how can there be logos in myth? Logos can only be added later on to myth as an exit from myth, but not as its enabling condition. To put it somewhat, I like pictures, so it helps me to understand things. So to put it into a sort of picture, we have the dark foundry. This is the image that came to mind. And when logos emerges from within that dark foundry, and that's a very difficult process in Schelling's philosophy of mythology, it includes long reflections on the view of the potencies and the way that Dionysos is a very important figure there, but I won't go into that. You see that there are two exits really out of that dark foundry. That's the poets, Homer and Hesiod, who you see here on top, and philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, but all the rest as well. So philosophy and poetry are exits from mythology. They're not the enabling conditions of mythology. So with that, Schelling seems to have done away with Schopenhauer's view of religion. Now, what is Schelling's own view of mythology? I won't spend too much time on it, but he's against the allegorical view because it cannot account for three things, namely what I just mentioned, the fact that myth must always precede mythology. So myth cannot communicate something that is conceptually true, because there were no conceptual truths in mythology. It can also not explain the many similarities between different mythologies, because if it's just an allegorical message, then that can be clothed into whatever. But the clothing, the outward message in mythology is remarkably similar. That's that Kreutzer debate again. I put on a nice image that you see on the left, the famous story of Heracles trying to decapitate the Hydra. And next to it, you see Krishna doing something very similar with a snake with a different name, but it's quite similar. And so you have a lot of overlaps between mythologies. So Schelling believes that this would be too coincidental if it was just trying to communicate an allegorical message. And a last argument would be that, sure, if mythology communicates an allegorical message, but why use that specific form of a history and system of the gods? Why use a language that is religious in nature to communicate something that is a-religious? Why use theistic language to communicate an atheistic message? Is that not just asking to be misunderstood? Why is then mythology so adamant about a religious message? So Schopenhauer's own view, which I mentioned briefly, because I want to get to the debate between Schelling and Schopenhauer, is what he calls a tautogorical interpretation of mythology. He stole that term from Coleridge. He admits to stealing it, so it's not as bad as you think. But it basically claims that mythology is what it purports to be, a system and history of the gods. What does that mean? Basically that, I'm really summarizing here, but that the mythology that we know is a sort of latent memory we have of us coming to consciousness, of the human race, the human people coming to consciousness. And there's a strong interplay between different potencies there, how this happens. How Schelling usually puts it in his study of mythology is that you see always the same thing occurring. So you have a sort of male principle in mythology that sort of tries to subsume everything underneath it. In Greek mythology, I'll stick to Greek mythology because people know it best. That's Uranus. Uranus is the sort of dominating male figure, next to which a female figure arises, Gaia, who is sort of the principle of acceptance, of embrace, of not sucking everything to you, but letting everything be. And by their union, something new is created, a new male principle. In Greek mythology, that's Kronos, who at some point overtakes the first male principle, who then conjoins with a new female principle, Rhea, to make a new male principle who overthrows Kronos. That's Zeus and the other Olympic gods were overthrown. So what do you see in mythology is a sort of circular motion of a dominating principle conjoining with a new principle, which creates something new, and the whole thing starts again. So it's the eternal circle. For those of you who are readers of Schelling's Ages of the World, that's the eternal rotary motion within God himself. And that cycle must be broken at some point. And that in Greek mythology is broken through the figure of Dionysus, who harkens forward to a sort of free state. He looks actually forward to Christ, according to Schelling. So, but what does that mean about what mythology teaches us? It teaches us something. It's a latent memory we have of something that is below, preceding, and enabling our reason. It teaches us something about a truth that cannot be put into concepts. It teaches us something, Pace Hegel, that cannot be framed in the language of spirit because it precedes the language of spirit. It teaches us the interplay of nature, interplay of the potencies. It teaches us something that we could not attain through a sort of systematic inference. So in the language of the later Schelling, negative philosophy, a system of reason, cannot attain to that first starting point because that has to be revealed freely in the sort of latent memory we have of mythology. And in his later philosophy, he would say that nature itself is also such a revelation, and ultimately Christianity, or Christ specifically, and the Christian church is equally such a revelation. So Schelling's own view against the allegorical view would be that mythology teaches us something that cannot be captured in the language of reason, that precedes and enables reason. And so it is very valuable for us to investigate it because it enriches us with something. It is interesting beyond merely an expression of reason. Now, getting back to Schopenhauer, because I love Schelling, but I love Schopenhauer more. I think Schelling, in his critique of the allegorical interpretation, is he never read Schopenhauer, obviously, not as far as I can tell, but I don't think his criticism of Schopenhauer is on point, because Schopenhauer's view is not that sort of allegorical view that Schelling rightly attacks. Why? Because in Schopenhauer's philosophy, religion, mythology, religion, does not convey a conceptual truth or insight. It does not convey something that can be captured in the language of concepts, much like the high point of Schopenhauer philosophy is a sort of intuitive insight into the unity of everything, which can so overtake you that you take all the suffering upon you that you cannot do other but self-deny yourself and reach a sort of state of nothingness. That's not a conceptual truth. Because if it were a conceptual truth, I've just explained it to you, you would all need to become ascetics right now. But you're not. I see some of you becoming slightly ascetic at the moment, but most of you are not. That's why it's not a conceptual truth. There's a conceptual truth to anyone who understands it has effect. But this has to be a truth that becomes intuitive, that you need not to be taught from the outside, but that should be taught from the inside. It's an intuitive insight. The same way that Schopenhauer says that, you know, your ethics do not make moral people, your aesthetics do not make artists. It's something else, something that cannot be taught through concepts. So what is mythology then in the end for Schopenhauer? I think the only way you can reconstruct that, I can only give a little bit of a hint of that, is through Schopenhauer's concept of genius. So the genius for Schopenhauer is the person who creates art. The person who creates art in Schopenhauer's view is someone who pierces through the sort of representational world of things being connected to each other and sees just the whatness of things. He doesn't look at a table and think, oh, I can sit there. No, he sees the idea table. I say he because Schopenhauer believes that only men can do it, but I think we can, you know, we don't have to stick with everything he says. But the genius has that sort of powerful intuition where he sees the Platonic idea and things, and through that sort of excess of intuition and an excess of imagination can recommunicate that in a piece of art. And he can persevere in that state of being, in that intuitive state of being, for such an excessive time. All of us can do it a little bit, but he can do it for such an excessive time that he's able to create powerful art. Now, I think for Schopenhauer's philosophy of religion to make sense, the prophet, or the person, or the people, or whoever creates mythology must work similarly. That the person who creates, or whoever creates mythology, must have a sort of excessive intuitive insight that simply overtakes them, and through a wonderful way of creative rethinking and imagination is able to put that into a message that is, as Schopenhauer says it, palatable to the masses of whom thinking cannot be asked. So he's a very hierarchical thinker. He believes that most of us are simply incapable of philosophy, so we need something a bit more palatable to our limited intellects, and that's why you need those stories, because they are more prone to arouse the right dispositions in us. But the origin is not a singular person. It's not a conceptual truth. It is a powerful insight that overtakes someone to such an extent that they just become a vessel for that message. Look at prophets. Prophets do not preach simple truths or simple messages. They are their messages. Their life that is their message. That's why Schopenhauer is so ecstatic when he talks about people like St. Francis of Assisi, more ecstatic than of a Napoleon or Caesar. It shows you something who is the message of ultimate truth, that life is about self-denial and reaching nothingness. So I don't think, to bring it all home, that I think they have wonderful views of mythology and religion, where they communicate something in excess of spirit, that I think is a nice counterweight to Hegel's philosophy. They seem to be at odds whether that truth is to be communicated allegorically, but I think what they ultimately mean when they speak of their views of religion mythology is very, very similar, with the very obvious and very important exception that for Schelling this leads to a sort of Christology and philosophy of revelation, and for Schopenhauer this leads to a very existential way of engaging with religion, one based on self-denial. So I hope I kept to the time, and I'm very happy to have any comments, questions, damning critiques. All of those are quite welcome. So I'll stop sharing this, and I can see your faces again. So.
Great, thank you. That was really interesting, Dennis. And thanks for keeping to the time. That's good too. Let's talk for about 15 minutes if you have questions or comments. And then let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll do the second part. Would anyone like to begin?
Maybe if someone has a question, that they can type that they have a question in the chat or something, some way of, so we're not talking over one another. Is that okay? Or how do you want to?
Ask,
okay.
I'll
Okay.
I'll have one question. That is, with regard, I mean, I guess it's Schopenhauer in particular, who wants to speak of mythology and religion as providing something that transcends reason as well as understanding. And I'm just wondering what you think about what Schopenhauer himself is doing. I mean, he's not, I take it, engaging in creating mythology, which he ascribes to people, you know, not to actual authors to begin with. And nor is he a prophet, or I don't know. I mean, I don't think he thinks of himself as a prophet for that matter. But he is, I guess, tapping into insights that he speaks of, I guess, as being beyond the reach of reason. But nonetheless, he has attained them, or he's presenting them in some respect, right? And does his own presentation of that to some degree call into question what he's saying about how the truths in question are things that really can't be argued for or presented in maybe even discursive communication.
Yeah, thanks. That's actually a very Hegelian question in the end, because the question is basically if you're able to speak of it, aren't you showing that the message is ultimately reasonable? The unreasonable doesn't not need to be ultimately ineffable, unspeakable, unknowable for it to be unreasonable. So the moment you speak of it, then you turn it into reason. So that's a very valid criticism, and it's not a criticism that I think Schelling can deal with a lot better than Schopenhauer. Because if I were Schopenhauer, Schopenhauer's response would probably be, well, I'm merely describing what happens here. I'm describing to the utmost of the possibilities of language what happens in the process of religion and mythology. But well, that's like, you know, I can describe to you what a color is or a taste is. I can do my best to try to describe it to you using mathematical formula and brain synapses and all that sort of thing. But to experience a color or a taste, that's different. And that is something that cannot be communicated in the language of reason. So Schopenhauer's philosophy ends on a sort of a downer in the end, that he says that, well, I run at the limits of language when I try to describe what happens at the highest moment of nothingness that can happen both in religion and in philosophy. At the end point of a proper pessimistic philosophy, his own philosophy, obviously. I can only, at best I can use sort of negative terms. It's a sort of ecstasy and nothingness, but that does not mean that the nothingness is a sort of absolute nothingness, an absolute other to everything we know. It's only a nothingness relative to all the things we know. But in a way, you cannot, that doesn't mean that it's not something in itself. So an absolute nothingness would be something that is nothing at all. It's not that. It is something, but it's not something of which we can speak. So Kant would say it would be a sort of, when Kant tries to talk about the noumenon, he says that, it is something, but it is something which, if I wanted to describe it, I have to leave behind all conceptual speaking. And that's the only sort of speaking I have. So I think Schopenhauer makes a point there by making that distinction between the lived experience and the sort of the knowing of things. There's a famous letter where Schopenhauer says that he had a very troublesome relationship with his publisher, Frauenstadt, and he must have been very nasty to Frauenstadt at some point. And he apologizes in the next letter, and he says that, well, my philosophy might teach about and teach and describe sainthood, but I ain't no saint. So all the sort of conceptual knowledge that he has does not lift him to saintliness. Something else is needed. And that something else is the sort of thing, it's, you can't speak of it almost, but it's something very, very real. And that happens in that intuitive experience and not in conceptual knowing. So did I sort of answer your question, or? I think you're still muted, Richard.
sorry, let me just pursue it in another way. You speak about how Schopenhauer has a ranking of religious traditions, in which I guess Buddhism is at the very apex. But of course, Buddhism has a tradition of philosophers who are, it would seem, employing reason to try to justify the doctrines to the extent that there are doctrines of the religion. I don't know to what degree he discusses these philosophers himself, but I'm wondering how he regards them. What are they doing? And is something they're doing, in any case, subverting what he has to say about Buddhism itself?
Yes, that's well, he doesn't address that with regard to Buddhism, but you have very similar things happening in Christianity, obviously. That, you have Christianity, but you have philosophers, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, Eckhart, who in some way try to explain what happens in Christianity. So he does discuss those people. And he says that that is a very dangerous mixing of philosophy and religion to such an extent that either religion becomes trite, empty, and optimistic, because philosophy intermingles with it, or philosophy becomes somewhat subservient to religion and has to sort of justify religion. And he looks at people like Hegel as people who are philosophers because they're not interested in the truth, they're interested in securing a paycheck. And that's why they speak their languages as just basically Christianity to him in more philosophical language. So obviously not entirely fair to Hegel, I'm aware of that. But he's very much opposed to people philosophizing within a sort of tradition of religion. Actually writing a paper on that at the moment, where Schopenhauer is a very sort of behind the scenes engagement with Spinoza's theological political treatise on this score, where Spinoza says there's two ways to truth, the religious and the philosophical one, and they deal with different things, but they should not mingle. And Schopenhauer believes that philosophy and religion should not mingle, but not because there's two ways. There's no two truths in Schopenhauer. There's two ways to the same truth. But those ways can only be reached if you keep those things far apart. Because otherwise philosophy will become a sort of spokesperson for religion, or religion will inevitably become something very optimistic, something very trite. He's very much opposed to what he calls Verstandsphilosophie or Religionsphilosophie. It's a sort of Gnostic wisdom, a strange centaur, an abomination, let's get rid of it. So that's how Schopenhauer would probably respond.
We have time for one more question or comment. Anyone? I have something I would say, but I prefer to give the space to someone else, if someone will.
Yeah, if there's no one asking a question through YouTube, maybe I can also have a question.
Why don't you go ahead, Emery? Why don't you go ahead and ask?
All right. I think my question is kind of similar to Richard's question. I mean, my question is about how we arrive at normative judgments as to what a religion should be like. When we speak of truth and good, for instance, then we usually think that we're in the domain of concepts and reason. But when it comes to religion or mythology, as Schelling has it, we're dealing with something that is hyper-rational. And as your account shows, when Schopenhauer, for instance, talks about what mythology needs to be like, he says quite specific things about what religion or mythology should convey, such as it's being pessimistic, for instance. So I'm wondering, when we speak in terms of intuition per Schopenhauer or memory of coming to consciousness per Schelling, we're talking about some content, but in what philosophical sense can we speak of those kinds of contents in normative terms? I mean, how do they do it?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Thanks. I'm looking at the time, and I will only sort of address it because we've been mostly talking about Schopenhauer. I'll address it from Schopenhauer's point of view. So Schopenhauer leaves that sort of framework far behind. So he does not want to talk in the sense of conceptions and norms the way that the sort of philosophical tradition does so. The whole discussion with regard to Schopenhauer is geared towards something he calls the metaphysische Bedürfnis, the metaphysical need of human beings. So for Schopenhauer, we're all willing beings. Willing comes first. Concepts come later. Concepts are always attuned to our willing. So concepts have no validity outside of our willing. With regard to our willing, certain concepts come up, philosophical concepts, certain stories come up, religious stories, and they can be attuned to our willing in different ways. Ultimately, their attunement is always geared towards the same thing, and that is towards delivering us from suffering. That's the ultimate goal of all willing, is to sort of, willing is suffering, and all we want to do is get rid of that suffering. Now, that suffering can be relieved in various ways. It can be relieved in the sort of, if I'm at my fourth beer tonight and I feel like another beer, I can have a fifth beer, I can have a sixth beer, and I might be happy for a moment, but the desire will always come back. I can also decide no more beer, done with beer, no more headaches. And that's the more robust way of leaving yourself from suffering. That's the more informed way. You know what will happen. You know how the world is. You know that you will always sort of circle back to need, unless if you break the cycle. So the only sort of normativity you have in Schopenhauer's philosophy is a normativity of being well-informed, truthful beings, where you can have your needs met in ways that are robust and that can be really deliver you from suffering, or it can be something that always returns you to suffering. And mythologies and religions do that. If you have a religion that says, oh, life is wonderful, pursue your desires, you will only sort of immerse yourself fuller in the sort of addicting ways of being needful, needy, and looking for pleasure. But if you have a religion that tells you through stories and in ways that really speak to you about leaving sort of these things behind and training yourself in ascetics and in self-denial and having wonderful figures like Christ and the Swamis and Francis of Assisi and all those people as sort of heroes before you, as something you could attain. Well, there is some truth in that. But it's not a truth based on concepts. It's a truth based on a very specific sense, mingling of will and thinking about will and thinking about suffering. So I get your question, and it's a question well informed by the tradition, but I think Schopenhauer tries to leave that behind. He's not entirely successful. We need to wait until Nietzsche to really pull that off. But I think Schopenhauer makes some impressive strides into the sort of direction that Nietzsche would like to take philosophy. But what was that sort of an answer to your question? Or? Thanks.
Let's pause here for 5 minutes and then come back for the second session. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. It's been 5 minutes approximately, so why don't we wait 1 more minute for people to come back, but let's come back to session. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Cecelia Mutatori is a tutor in philosophy at the Institute of Continuing Education, University of Cambridge, and honorary fellow at the University of Warwick. Her first monograph is dedicated to the mystical philosopher Jakob Boehme and his remarkable afterlives in German idealism, and especially in the reception of Hegel. This monograph is entitled "The First German Philosopher, Mysticism in Jakob Boehme," as interpreted by Hegel. This is published by Springer in 2016. And then she has a second monograph, which is devoted to debates on eating animals in early modernity, with the title "Renaissance Vegetarianism, the Philosophical Afterlives of Porphyry on Abstinence." This is a new piece that came out in 2020 with Oxford. She's interested in the mediation of philosophical concepts through the visual arts and is co-curator of a special series of philosophical exhibitions on Jakob Boehme for the Städtliche Kunstsammlungen Dresden. So the talk today, the title I have is "The Magician and the Oak Tree, Hegel as a Reader of Boehme." Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. I'll share my screen. See if I can show you my PowerPoint. Can you see it? Yeah, great. So Hegel famously called the early modern philosopher Jakob Boehme the first German philosopher, a weighty and often misunderstood definition. And I will suggest that this label is the result of Hegel's attempt to rehabilitate Boehme, showing that he deserved to be considered a philosopher and not an enlightened mystic and a religious Meister. And with this reading, I therefore strongly object to considering Hegel's engagement with Boehme as an instance of Hegel's supposed esoteric interests, as it has been sometimes suggested. And on the contrary, I will claim that Boehme for Hegel is a philosopher precisely because of his tireless effort to express philosophical thought, an effort therefore towards exotericism, not esotericism. Boehme's philosophy experienced a revival between the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century in Germany. And in the 18th century, his collected works were published twice under the title Theosophia Revelata, once in 1715 in 2 volumes. We'll see this is the edition that Hegel owned, and then again in 1730, and this is the edition that we still use for the vast majority of Boehme's works, because we're still lacking a critical edition. Hegel started to read Boehme relatively late in comparison to his contemporaries. We know that in Jena, the group around the Schlegel brothers was reading and discussing Boehme already in the last years of the 18th century. Hegel, on the other hand, received his copy of the 1715 edition later on from an ex-student of his in Jena, Van Hert, who had since moved to the Netherlands and had become an expert in animal magnetism. And there is a connection between the interest in animal magnetism and in Boehme at the time, but I won't get into the details of this. So I'll see if I can. Is it showing you the next slide? Yeah, now. Yes, great. So on the 22nd of June 1810, Van Heert had written to Hegel, I'm quoting, you see the quotations on the slide. I don't know whether you have Jakob Boehme's collected works, and since these are very rare in Germany, I would like to give you his luxury edition, 2 volumes in folio, as a memento. Please tell me sincerely whether and how I can send this to you. And Hegel replies, I accept with warmest thanks your nice present of the folio edition of Boehme's writings. I had already wished for a long time to acquire the complete collections of his works. I'm twice as happy to receive such an excellent edition and to receive it from your generosity. And then in the letter in which he tells Van Heert that he has finally received the 2 volumes, this is a year later in 1811, he explains, this is an important passage, I'm quoting, finally your good intention has been realized and Jakob Boehme, together with the other enclosures, has reached me safely. I send you my warmest thanks for this nice gift, a memento of friendship. It has delighted me. The edition and the copy are excellent. Now I can study Jakob Boehme more precisely than before, since I did not own his writings. There are several references to Boehme before this date in Hegel's works, for instance, in the so-called Waste Book. So we know that Hegel had some knowledge of Boehme already in Jena, and this is no surprise given the revival I mentioned before. But I believe that his knowledge of Boehme before 1811 was superficial. The letter in which Hegel acknowledges receipt of the Theosophia Revelata survives in draft form, and but it gives us a first glimpse of the basic lines of Hegel's interpretation of Boehme's philosophy, and it anticipates some of the themes of Hegel's later interpretation of Boehme. So I'm quoting a longer extract now. His theosophy, so Boehme's theosophy, remains one of the most extraordinary attempts of a deep and yet uneducated man to grasp the most inward nature of the absolute being. For Germany, he is of particular interest, since he is actually the first German philosopher. Considering the limited capability of his time and his own limited learning with respect to abstract thinking, his striving is the toughest struggle to bring into representation the deep speculative element which he has in his intuition, and at the same time to subdue the element of representation in such a way that the speculative element may be expressed in it. Therefore, so little remains constant and firm in this, since he always feels the inadequacy of the representation to that which he wants to express, and so turns it upside down again. And it is because this upturning of the absolute reflection is without determinate consciousness and without the form of the concept that such a great confusion appears. Apart from recognizing the general depth of his foundational principles, it becomes difficult, or it seems to me, so Hegel writing in 1811, impossible to unravel anything which has to do with detail and determination. So Boehme's philosophy takes the form, in Hegel's view, of an attempt. The word in German is Versuch, and indeed one of the most extraordinary and peculiar attempts known in the history of philosophy. German philosophy, and this is a key point, starts off with Boehme's philosophical experiment. And this is why Hegel names him the first German philosopher or as he says elsewhere, also Philosophus Germanicus. And this is fundamentally important because not only is Boehme considered by Hegel to be a philosopher to all effects, but he's even introduced as the one philosopher who inaugurated the German philosophical tradition. The way in which the profound and yet uncultivated Boehme moves ahead by attempt is, according to Hegel, the prime characteristic of his thought. The purpose towards which Boehme's philosophy tends is the understanding of what Hegel calls the intimate nature of the absolute. And Hegel points to this very powerful tension, the struggle, talks of Kampf, that is generated by the desire of this uneducated man to use thought in order to grasp the essence, the absolute. In other words, Boehme's writing expresses the toughest struggle, which concerns the effort of expressing in words and in images, or rather in representation, Vorstellungen, it's a word that recurs very often in Hegel's interpretation of Boehme. He tries to express in representations the speculative profundity to which he had intuition, again, an important word, Anschauung. But the most extraordinary aspect of Boehme's attempt is the way in which he brings about this kind of translation of speculative profundity into representations. Hegel states that Boehme does violence, literally, to the element of representation in such a way that it is able to express, or we could say even to contain, the speculative element. Boehme's violence is therefore to be found in the untiring imagination with which he creates new representations, new expressions, which are aimed at communicating the speculative nucleus that lies at the root of his mystical intuition, or, if we use Hegel's terminology, his Anschauung. Boehme, Hegel suggests, doesn't think in an abstract way, but always through representations. In other words, through a figured and a non-conceptual language. The paradox of Boehme is to be found precisely here. He employs a multitude of images to communicate the intimate nature of the absolute, precisely because he realizes that each representation is inadequate for the purpose for which it has been chosen. And here emerges one of the constant themes in Hegel's interpretation of Boehme. Hegel maintains that Boehme does not possess the form of the concept, which Hegel regards, of course, as the only one capable of really communicating speculative profundity. But in Boehme's case, this does not lead to an apophatic silence, but rather in its opposite, a rather extreme linguistic and expressive creativity, through which he brings into operation such a flurry of images that nothing in his writing remains still, fixed. I think this is a very perceptive reading by Hegel. If you have read Boehme, you see what he means. There is something in tension, something constantly moving. The conclusion of this judgment by Hegel is particularly significant. Hegel recognizes the great profundity of Boehme's vision of its fundamental principles, but he says it is difficult, or it seems to me impossible, to express a view on the details of such a philosophical conception, which seems to be something of a great confusion. And whether it is really impossible or possible but difficult to find a way through Boehme's terminology is really the problem that Hegel will tackle from 1811 onwards. Hegel devotes a large section of the lectures on the history of philosophy to Boehme. The key element, which I can only briefly mention here, is that the amount of references to Boehme's works and the overall length of the session increases over time, as Hegel continued to teach on the subject. So he continues evidently to study Boehme and to add references to further works that he starts to read in detail. And this is only evident if one compares the individual manuscripts relating to the courses that he taught on the history of philosophy. And yet sometimes we come across passages that are only present in the collated edition published after Hegel's death. And this is the case with the following extract, which I'm quoting now. If on the one hand it is coarse and barbarous, it is unbearable to read him continuously and to keep hold of the thought. It is a constant swirl of qualities, spirits, angels. This rough mind, nevertheless, actually possesses indeed an extraordinary barbarous force in using actuality as concept. In the background is the most speculative thought, which, however, does not arrive at the form suitable to it. Systematic presentation is not to be expected from him, nor a truthful demonstration into singularities. The adjective barbarous has a double meaning in this quotation. On the one hand, Boehme writes in a coarse and barbarous manner, since he's using a terminology which is unsuitable to philosophy, and which makes the reader dizzy, confused. On the other hand, however, he possesses an extraordinary barbarous force, with the help of which he uses reality as though it were a concept. This means that Boehme requires a tremendous power to bend reality, that is to say, sensory substances, to an improper use, pushing towards the attribution of a conceptual meaning. In the first case, therefore, barbarous is synonymous with crude, coarse. But in the second, the barbarity is instead linked to the force, a kind of excessive energy with which Boehme uses terms that describe sensory objects as though they were conceptual expressions. Hegel clearly emphasizes the fact that Boehme is straining the language in his attempt to communicate a concept through a terminology which is derived from the word of tangible things. And this is certainly indicative of the incapacity on the part of Boehme. So Boehme is literally incapable of expressing himself through concepts. And yet Hegel recognizes that Boehme in his writings is making something of a tremendous, extraordinary, in this sense barbarous, forceful attempt to mold a terminology of his own, which is more suited to communicate the speculative foundation of his philosophy. The task seems impossible, because how can reality be used as a concept? And yet Boehme responds to this impossibility with a force that is indeed barbarous in the sense of excessive, enormous. In the manuscript of the Lectures on the History of Philosophy written by Otto in 1823-24, we read, "But through the strength of his spirit, he breaks up forms, since he possesses in the background the most profound speculation." Boehme breaks up pre-established forms thanks to what Hegel here names the strength of his spirit. The reason why he exerts this pressure on the language, it's a pressure it's a pressure that is translated into a violent separation between concrete things and their usual meanings, is to be found in the fact that Boehme in the background possesses the most profound speculation. So this is important for Hegel. The breaking of forms that derives from this is therefore caused by the desire to give voice to the speculative nucleus, letting it finally emerge into the foreground. This is the exoteric efforts to which I was referring at the beginning. So a more careful study, it can therefore be seen that Hegel is not simply revealing the hiatus that stands out in the foreground, so expressing barbarity, and that which slips in the background, the speculation, but he's also providing an explanation for this phenomenon. It is this very desire to bring out the speculative content that is the reason why Boehme, knowing no other suitable method for this situation, has created a very particular language, the first language of German philosophy, a language which is barbarous, coarse, but is also forceful, energetic. Even where Boehme's language is criticized, movement still plays a central role for Hegel. And Hegel, in fact, complains that Boehme's terminology has an excessive mobility, so that the reader is unable to hold anything firm. And again, this is an insightful remark, because indeed Boehme's terminology is really not fixed. It also changes a lot over time. The barbarous force of this terminology is expressed in an extravagant use of imagery, which creates something of a kaleidoscopic effect. And Hegel, in the passage that I just quoted, refers to the spinning around of qualities, angels, spirits, most likely has in mind Boehme's first book, Aurora, and the idea, the doctrine of the seven qualities, which to Hegel is something of a whirlwind here. Hegel finds in Boehme's writing a strong emphasis towards the expression of the speculative nucleus, as I said. In other words, the intention of the mystic is to communicate the depth of speculation, and to do this by inventing always new representations and always new words to express this nucleus. And in this respect, in the manuscript of 1823-24, we read that the use of representations leads to the feeling of a painful struggle, since Boehme is laboriously trying to bring together, literally zusammenfassen, components that inevitably tend to fall apart, what in the text is auseinanderfallen, creating a situation of permanent instability. He seeks, in fact, to apply the concept to an image so as to be able to transmit it, but concept and barbarous representation cannot possibly hold together and are therefore designed to separate, opening a kind of a communication gap between them. But what characterizes Boehme's barbarous attempt is the continual persistence of this tension between concept and representation. And this is what generates this violent conflict, the painful struggle Hegel talks about. In other words, the attempt to communicate the speculative content is kept alive despite the inadequacy of the means used for the purpose. And this very friction between the desire for expression and the failure to achieve its purpose means that the first impression of anyone reading Boehme is that of witnessing a battle in progress. In the correspondence with Van Heert, I already mentioned that Hegel had stated that for Germany, Boehme is of particular interest since he's actually the first German philosopher. And this, as we have already noted, is a crucial statement. German philosophy for Hegel emerges at the beginning of the 17th century with Boehme, not before. In the 1825-26 lecture course on the history of philosophy, we read, I'm quoting, "He has been called the Philosophus Teutonicus, and indeed it is through him that philosophy made its appearance for the first time in Germany with a distinctive character." I hope you can still see the slides okay. If not, let me know. Great. Or in the version compiled by Michelet, we read, "Jakob Boehme is the first German philosopher. The content of his philosophizing is genuinely German." So first of all, it has to be asked, what was the particular distinctive character of German philosophy that Hegel was referring to in these lines, and which he found for the first time in the writings of Boehme? So in other words, in what sense was the philosophy of Boehme specifically German? The answer is partly contained in the position that Boehme occupies in the lectures on the history of philosophy, where he represents the mirror opposite of Bacon's external philosophizing, as Hegel calls it. Compared to Bacon's philosophical method, which, according to Hegel, is based on observation of the natural world, Boehme's philosophy retreats instead into the inner depth of the subject. So the distinctive character that Hegel attributes to the entire course of German philosophy, inaugurated by the speculation of Boehme, consists in this very capacity to elaborate a philosophical discourse starting off from the discovery of the inner depth. In this sense, Boehme is the first German philosopher, since his thought is directed inwards, not outwards. It concentrates on the subject. And this is why Hegel insists on the adjective profound, tief, to describe Boehme's mysticism. Profundity is considered to be the fundamental quality of his philosophy in the German language, and Boehme was, so to speak, its founder. During the lecture course of 1825-26, which I've already mentioned, Hegel clarifies this point in the following way. One side is the entire coarse and barbarous presentation. On the other hand, is apparent the German deep spirit, which deals with what is most inward, and in doing so brings out its force, its strength. Hegel states that, yes, so you find the quotation here. Hegel states that Boehme possesses the profound German spirit, and on the other hand, the profundity typical of German philosophy is related to power, to force, Macht, Kraft, that emanates from this same interiority. The genuinely Teutonic character of Boehme's speculation, therefore, doesn't simply consist in having internalized the fulcrum of philosophical reading, but philosophical reasoning, but is also it consists in the energy that underlines such an approach. Hegel writes that it is a barbarous form of presentation and expression, a struggle of his spirit against language, and the content of this struggle is the most profound idea, which discloses the unification of the most absolute opposites. Boehme's Teutonic spirit struggles with language in order to give expression to the most profound idea. The mystic struggle against language, as I've already said, is embodied in his barbarous prose, the prose that the reader finds difficult to enter. And yet this very almost warlike attitude towards the expressive capacity of the words ultimately defines the profoundness of Boehme's plan, which seeks to elaborate the content of radical importance, summarized by Hegel in these terms as the unification of the most absolute opposites. This attempt at unification may refer to what, according to Hegel, is the central core of Boehme's philosophy, that is to say, the relationship between the opposites expressed religiously, so God and Lucifer. In this sense, God and Lucifer are the absolute opposites in conflict, and whom Boehme wants to unite. But the barbarities of form and the profundity of the idea can also be meant as those absolute opposites which Boehme is seeking to unite, so to fit together, bring about a violent conflict within the subject. These two opposing elements are so mutually interdependent that it is difficult even to talk about Boehme's thought without at the same time embracing the form in which this thought is expressed. In other words, we cannot attempt to explain the content of Boehme's philosophy without becoming involved as readers in the same struggle in which the spirit of Boehme was himself immersed, and accept the inadequacy of form as an integral part of the speculation. So at the base of the Teutonic nature of Boehme's writings is therefore the idea of tension, to which the lectures of 1823-24 refer in these terms. I'm quoting again. He called himself Theosophus Teutonicus, and we can say that the manner of his striving was genuinely German. The deep speculation that Hegel regards as a fundamental characteristic of German philosophy is linked from its very origins to the violent, enthusiastic force of Boehme's language. If Luther gave the Bible a German voice for the first time, Boehme gave philosophy a German voice for the first time. Before Boehme, in other words, there was no philosophical lexicon in the German language, so it's a very important position that he plays. Hegel integrates, and I'll get to my last point here, Hegel even integrates certain words from Boehme's vocabulary in his own philosophical vocabulary. And as last point, I will provide an example of how Hegel deals with Boehme's language, how he attempts to clarify it and to retain what is philosophically valuable in it, rejecting what he considers not to be of philosophical interest. Sometimes Hegel quotes substantial passages from Boehme's works, and he interrupts them with comments and explanations. So this is an extract from the 1825-26 lecture course, which I'm now quoting. In italics, you see Hegel's intervention in Boehme's text. The beginning of all beings is the word as God's exhalation. For word, he means the revelation of divine will. The word is the outflow of the divine one, and yet it is God. What has flown out is the wisdom of all powers, dynamis. From such a revelation of all powers, in which the will of the eternal contemplates itself, flow intellection and knowledge of the egoity, ichts, brackets, opposite to the nothing, nichts, self-consciousness in the spirit, revelation of vitality to itself. Now, the other is image and resemblance of God. This he calls mysterium magnum, the separator, creator of all creatures, outflow from the will, which makes the one divided. The Son is the heart that pulsates in the Father, the core of all powers. He's the brightness which shines in the Father. If the Son were not to shine in the Father, then the latter would be a dark valley. In reality, this is not one quote, it's two quotes that Hegel puts together. He often does that when commenting on Boehme. The first quote starts with the words at the beginning of all beings, and it's taken from the third chapter of Von göttlicher Beschaulichkeit, of divine contemplation, which in turn opens with the first lines of John's Gospel. And where the quotation carries on with the Son is the heart, this is the second passage, which is taken from the third chapter of Boehme's Aurora. So the juxtaposition of these two passages is justified by the way in which Hegel interprets the figure of the separator, which appears at the end of the first quotation. The concept of separation, which Boehme makes into separator, is in fact the fulcrum of the whole discussion based by Hegel on the texts cited. The choice of these two passages and the way they're linked together show unequivocally how Hegel was interested in Boehme's description of divine separation. So the separation of the divine is really what interests Boehme, what he thinks is the philosophical nucleus. The reference to the Gospel of John is used to introduce the problem of the emergence of the separation inside the divine from a bottomless divine, which Boehme calls Ungrund, a word, by the way, which Hegel never uses, but this is a different story. So the John's logos in the language of Boehme, logos becomes divine action, so the breathing, the exhalation of God. Feeling that this use of the word, so Wort, requires an explanation, Hegel inserts an explanation into the quotation. And he says for word, he means the revelation of divine will. And it is precisely at the moment of revelation, that is to say, of separation, that Hegel places the emphasis in his reconstruction, tracing a path that leads back to Aurora, Boehme's first book. The bottomless, immobile nature of the eternal will, the bottomless original abyss, is here not mentioned. And yet, immediately after the word force, Kraft, Hegel makes another digression in which he provides a translation of the German word in Greek, so dynamis, to underline the fact that the word emanating from God is dynamism, its energy, its mobility. The next phrase then has the additions that are the most relevant from my point of view. Boehme writes from, in the quotation you see on the slide, from such a revelation of all powers in which the will of the eternal contemplates itself, follow intellection and knowledge of the egoity, ichts. And ichts is a Boehmian word, difficult to render in English. And this is why Hegel believes it appropriate to add a comment again. And this is again a pun used by Boehme. So ichts is the opposite of nichts. And Hegel observes that from the original divine is emanated an I, so from nothingness to ich. So the created subject has its roots in nothingness from Boehme. The second parenthesis in the commentary on Boehme's Ich contains what we could call an attempt at translation by Hegel. According to Hegel, Ich, he says, represents self-consciousness in the spirit, a relationship of vitality to itself. So the emergence of self-consciousness is also given the characteristic of vitality. And the passage from nicht to ich is in fact responsible for the generation of life. After Hegel's translation of Ich, the text continues with a slight deviation from Boehme, because Boehme writes in the text, this image and likeness is the mysterium magnum, the creator of all beings and creatures, because it is the separator in the outflow of the will, which makes the will of the eternal one divided, is the dividedness of the will. Hegel instead continues with this text, with an alternative text. The other is image and resemblance of God. This he, Boehme, calls mysterium magnum, the separator, creator of all creatures, outflow from the will, which makes the one divided. And here Hegel has added a further definition of this image of God, the I that emanates from nothing, that is to say, the other, das andere. Given the fact that the figure of the separate other plays a central role in the references to Boehme, this is a significant addition from the side of Hegel. So he adds the other, das andere. In this way, Hegel is clearly linking the two quotations. The separator, so the one who makes the one separate, is not clearly identified with Lucifer by Boehme, but he's presented as the emergence of subjectivity from the original nothingness. But Hegel introduces the quote from Aurora that describes the generation of the son from the father as a similar original separation through which the father expresses his force in the figure of the son. And this identification between the son and the separator cannot be found in these terms in Boehme. So this is Hegel's interpretation.
Cecelia, I just want to know that we're running over time a little bit. So could we wrap it up in a couple of minutes?
Yes, I'll come to the conclusion.
Thanks.
So this is an example of how Hegel intervenes in Boehme's own text with his marginal notes. So I'll conclude and try to say why his interpretation, his reading is important. In the manuscript of the lecture on the history of philosophy of 1823-24, there is a marginal note with an extract from Shakespeare's The Tempest, translated by Schlegel. And I'll quote the passage. As a comparison, one should mention a passage from Shakespeare's The Tempest. Jacob Boehme is the spirit which is imprisoned in a gnarled and rigid oak, just like Prospero wants to imprison Ariel. Jacob Boehme here is compared to Ariel, the spirit imprisoned in the hollow of an oak by the witch Sycorax and liberated by Prospero. And what I want to suggest to conclude is that Hegel sees himself as the Prospero who wants to liberate Boehme from the oak of the barbarous expression. So he wants to free Boehme from his own limitations and reveal what's inside the oak. So what's relevant in his the speculative nucleus, we could say. And this is precisely Hegel's contribution, I believe, to the rediscovery of Boehme's thought in the 19th century. So an attempt to read Boehme as a philosopher, a very selective attempt. This is also why the metaphor of the oak is important. So Hegel means to leave inside the oak what he considers not to be speculatively important, interesting of Boehme's philosophy, and liberating only the parts of his thought which he considers to be philosophically important, and what he considers to be the contribution of Boehme to the history of philosophy. So the reasons why he is the first German philosopher. So I'll end here.
Great, thank you, Cecelia. That's wonderful. I spoke privately with Greg for a moment, and we were talking about staying for 10 minutes extra. If you're not able to, though, you can just exit at any point. So why don't we do about 20 minutes or 18 minutes or so of questions, and who would like to start? Greg?
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot for your talk. Thanks to both of you for your very excellent talks. I learned from both of them. I haven't read Dennis's book yet, or books, although I plan to. I have read parts of Cecilia's book on Hegel and Boehme. I was really impressed by it, so I really wanted to have you present, so thank you for coming. I'm glad that we could make it happen one way or the other. Yeah, I would, again, highly recommend her book on Hegel and Boehme. I have a question about Meister Eckhart, actually. So what I'd like to know is, why is he not the first German philosopher? You know, so I'm thinking that when I was thinking about the reasons why Hegel says that Boehme is the first German philosopher, like that Boehme retreats to the inner depth of the spirit, and I was thinking Eckhart retreats to the inner depths of the spirit, and then there's this. It's not clear to me to what extent there is this barbarous struggle in Eckhart. I mean, Eckhart is eloquent and precise in a way that Boehme arguably is not, or there is a kind of refinement, right? Because Eckhart writes in Latin and he writes in German, right? So there's a refinement in Eckhart that isn't there in Boehme in a certain way, right? He's not the uneducated shoemaker or whatever. So I was just curious, you know, if you could speak to that. I mean, is it an unjust for Hegel to overlook Eckhart? Does he overlook him? I know that he does talk about him, comment on him at times, but I was hoping that you could say something about why Eckhart doesn't count.
Yeah.
So thanks.
Yeah, so first of all, it comes to mind, there is an interesting book. I can retrieve the details. I think the author is Fischer. I can't remember the title right now. So in the 18th, 19th century, there's a lot of confusion about what Eckhart actually wrote. So most of what we now know as Eckhart's works are attributed to Tauler at the time. So there is a lot of confusion there about Eckhart as an author. So, and Eckhart is sometimes viewed as deriving materials from Tauler. So there is, I remember, as I said, it's a point that's made in this book. I believe the author is Fischer. So that there are, so to speak, so historical philological reasons partly why Eckhart is not yet the big name as we see now. Then there is the issue of language, as you rightly say. So Boehme never writes in Latin. Interestingly, when he uses Latin, it's kind of secondhand. So he does use Latin words, and that makes it even more confusing. Hegel even complains about it because they're not used with the meaning that the words should have in Latin. So he even twists the meaning of Latin words to make them to create new words, really. So in that sense, Boehme is only writing German. So his entire linguistic struggle is in German. There are, if I remember correctly, there are some references to a conversation between Hegel and Baader, where Eckhart is mentioned, and Hegel is supposed to have been quite positive towards Eckhart, but it's not comparable to the study of Boehme. So the section Boehme in the lectures on the history of philosophy is really substantial. So I can't remember now exactly, but it's like the third or the fourth after Kant, Schelling. So it really is a surprisingly large section. So there is an in-depth reading there that you just didn't have in the case of Eckhart. But it's a very legitimate and very good question, because there were other writers, other philosophers who wrote in German before Boehme. So the fact that he places Boehme at the threshold of modernity. So Boehme comes in, so it is positioned in a couple, as I said, with Bacon just before Descartes. So it's not yet modern philosophy, but just on the threshold. So the position is also historically important.
Can I just jump in on that?
Yeah, Dennis, go ahead.
Thanks. So I had a similar question as Greg did, and one of the reasons is that so the way that Hegel seems to present the way that Boehme is a German philosopher seems to be mostly with regard to manner of writing and style, formal issues. I wrote a few of your notes down.
Mm-hmm.
The manner of his striving was genuinely German. So, which made me think, okay, this seems to be mostly a formal issue. And then I thought, well, why not Eckhart? And why not some other mystics? And there were a lot of mystics to which Hegel was well disposed. Ruysbroek, for instance, seems to be a mystic that's pretty. So there's a whole bunch of people that could have been eligible, which made me think, is there a little bit more to the content of what Boehme said as well that makes him very likable to Hegel? And you actually, in the slide, you I think number 7, you stopped at for a very long time. You seem to point out that there is a lot of sort of overlap between Hegel and Boehme, while Hegel has a more philosophical language and Boehme puts things in more theosophistical language or esoterical language. So in your opinion, I know Schelling basically says that Hegel and Boehme are the same. They basically say the same thing. What do you think of that point, that there is so significant a overlapping content as well between Hegel and Boehme?
Yeah, so thank you. So the striving is, it's not just about the language, although it's strictly connected to language, but it's about the direction. So this going towards the inner depth. So rather than looking outwards, that's why he needs Boehme to be coupled with Bacon. So Bacon looks outwards and Boehme looks inwards, and that turning inwards is a sign of a specifically German attitude in philosophy. So the two go together. So it's not just about the language. So the language is, I think, an important factor, because there is also this parallel between Luther, who makes the Bible speak German, and Boehme, who tries to create the first vocabulary for philosophy in German. So interestingly, Hegel does not reject Boehme's puns, which is interesting. So you would think that so Hegel, for instance, completely rejects authors like Paracelsus. That's just alchemical hocus pocus. That the same thing does not apply to Boehme. So he doesn't reject all this creative words, but it's the connection between the language and the direction of the philosophical inquiry. So there's this going inwards. And perhaps I can connect this with your point about Schelling. I briefly mentioned that Hegel, at least in the documents we have, so we have to be mindful that a lot of documents have been lost. So in what we have, Hegel never talks about Boehme's Ungrund, which is very interesting. He could have, because he does quote from works where Boehme does use the word. And instead, in one of the slides that I showed, he quotes from Boehme's Aurora, where Boehme talks about the dark valley of the father. The dark valley of the father in Boehme's thought is a sort of first attempt to define what later on will become the Ungrund. Boehme, so the language evolves, and he always introduces new terms, which makes it even more complicated. I suspect that the reason is that because he objects to Schelling's reading of Boehme. That's why Ungrund is, so to speak, the key word of Schelling's interpretation of Boehme. And Hegel is saying that the core, what is important in Boehme's philosophy, is not the definition of the bottomless abyss, but it's the division. It's a sort of proto-dialectic, of course. So it's the separation, the element of the separator. So the struggle that opens up between God and the Son. And Hegel is very keen to invest that figure of the Son of a dual meaning. So the Son is at the same time Lucifer and Christ. So that is what matters in also logically in Hegel's terms. So the separation, so the negativity does not come afterwards. It comes together. So God becomes the Father when the Son is generated, and the Son is plural. So it's a son of darkness and a son of light, as Boehme would say. So I think that is where the interpretations of Hegel and Schelling are radically different.
We have time for one or two questions. We can also ask more questions to Dennis if that comes up. Great.
Maybe I can follow up again really briefly. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with your responses, Cecelia, about, so would you say in your estimation that the disagreements, well, the fact that Hegel doesn't use the word Ungrund is an implicit way of seeing the differences in what Hegel and Schelling want to emphasize in their readings of Boehme, that in a way they're battling each other by giving differing readings of Boehme and emphasizing different things. So we can see the reading of Boehme as a kind of battleground between Hegel and Schelling.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And I said it briefly also. It's interesting that Hegel really starts to get serious about Boehme much later than everybody else, including Schelling. That's also kind of typical. So it's really in the so from 1811 onwards, and really in the Berlin courses, we see that the amount of material on Boehme radically increases. So it really is a different trajectory. It doesn't seem to interact a lot with the reading of Boehme that was going on in Jena at the time. So although he strongly objects to Tieck's reading, so the attempts to read Boehme as an enlightened, as a mystic, really, which is also going back to Dennis's point. That's why, so Hegel is not after mystics. That's not, so he's not, so Boehme is not in the company of other mystics, he's in the company of philosophers for Hegel. That's why he doesn't really do that kind of comparison. There are also, I couldn't get to this for reasons of time, and as you've seen, it's there is already too much to say even about just a few quotations. But Hegel even objects to the reading of mysticism as as something, as an alternative path to philosophy. So he does connect mysticism to speculation. So there is mysticism which is valuable for philosophy is connected to speculation, and then there are also kinds of mysticism which are similar, akin to the jump that people like Jacobi would propose. So where that kind of mysticism where you jump to the intuition, so you don't explain the path to the intuition, but you jump. So in that sense also there is a similarity, I think, with Kant. So in the on a recently prominent tone of superiority in philosophy, where Kant objects to mysticism intended as that the jump to conclusions which is not accountable, which does not explain the passages in between. So for Hegel, that is not what Boehme does. Boehme is trying desperately to account for the passages, so to turn the intuition into words. And that's also why Hegel talks of Boehme. So Boehme does talk about mystical experiences, and Boehme Hegel is keen to, in a sense, play them down. So they are Anschauungen, so they are philosophical intuitions, more than moments in which one experiences a supernatural reality. The philosophical intuitions, which unfortunately are expressed not in the correct language. So we need a translator, basically, and that's how Hegel presents himself. That's my reading, as a translator of Boehme. And that's why I picked that section in which you could see how exactly he does that, how he translates Boehme for his students. So Boehme is a philosopher, but a philosopher who expresses himself in an inadequate language. So with this barbarous form. It's a barbarous form that is energetic for philosophy. That's where the difference between mysticism that is valuable for philosophy and mysticism which is a risk for philosophy, that's where the difference sits. So Boehme is a kind of a mystic who brings philosophy forward. He doesn't block philosophical reasoning. But Hegel is very selective. I also wanted to kind of signal that. So there are some aspects, so he really picks from Boehme what he thinks is valuable philosophically and leaves everything else behind. So extremely selective reading of Boehme.
Let's end there. I feel my role here is to keep track of the time, and I think we could talk for a long time together, and we should. But how about we come back tomorrow? Greg, do you want to say anything about the schedule from here?
Yeah, so thank you everybody for coming today and participating. Thank you in particular to the speakers for presenting their papers, and everyone who's watching this on YouTube. I hope you go buy their books, or at least read their books. Maybe they're a little expensive. Dennis has his book there. Okay, Exceeding Reason. Very good. You have your book there, Cecelia. You can share it in front of this, or you have two books, but maybe you have the
I have this one, which is really a very different subject.
Well, you might as well promote it here. You have a free excellent.
The first German philosophy is somewhere around me.
Okay. Found it. Yeah.
This is the other one.
Oh, there you go. There it is. Very good. First German Philosophy. Very good book. Okay, very good. Excellent. Okay, and tomorrow we have a book panel on Richard Dean Winfield's book, Religion, Modernity, and the War on Terror. Yes, and that's tomorrow, and it's at I think it's 7 p.m. Hong Kong time, and that is 6 a.m. for Richard Winfield. So my apologies, Richard, that you have to get up so early, but at least it's not 3 a.m. like today. So yeah. We can't hear you, Richard. Sorry. You have to unmute yourself. Sorry.
I think today will help me get into the time frame I need to be in.
Yeah. So okay, good. Yeah, thank you, Richard, for coming despite it being 3 a.m. And yeah, thank you everybody who came. We have people from Berlin and Japan and the United States, and we're London, and we're everywhere. So I'm glad that we could somehow all come together. So hopefully I'll see a lot of you tomorrow, and we'll be joined also with Sebastian Stein from Heidelberg, who will also comment on Richard's book along with Emre as well. And I think I'm moderating this session, so I'll also be there. Great. Okay. Well, have a good night or a good day or a good morning, whatever it is where you are, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Okay.
Till then.
Everybody. So long. Thanks. Bye.